This week is a little bit special. We took the opportunity to interview some of the many interesting people attending the SNP Spring Conference. So, sit back and enjoy an extra large helping of the full Scottish. Kirsty Blackman, Aberdeen North MP, thank you very much for joining us today at Broadcasting Scotland. We'll kick things off with a topical discussion, Brexit as usual. I asked your colleague Ian Blackford a similar question, so this will take your view on it. How effective can you be with only 35 Ps in Westminster when the Conservative government is determined to push through a Brexit bill which will fundamentally change the devolution settlement?
I mean, the reality is that it's a minority Conservative government, and therefore we've got quite a lot of opportunity to kind of push in certain directions and to hold them to account, more than we probably could if they were a majority government and could just trammel through any votes that they like. I think actually the biggest concern is, for me, is the fact that in order to defeat the Conservative government on this, we need to get the Labour Party to actually be pointing in the right direction. And considering the Labour Party can't get the Labour Party to point in the right direction, it's a real struggle for us. We are the most effective team of 35 that I've ever worked in. It's actually amazing how well we work together and how much of a kind of coherent voice that we are, and the impact that we make, despite being only 35 in the House of Commons. It's very clear that, it's very difficult for the House of Commons and the UK government to forget about Scotland now because of the voice of the SNP in Parliament.
You talk about the Labour Party maybe not being in the right direction, but recently we have put forward amendments to the Brexit bill which, as they claim to make their position absolutely clear. In your opinion, do you believe that the Labour's position on Brexit is any clearer?
I don't think it's particularly clear. I don't think it's much clearer than it was before. I think actually the decision to... Everybody's arguing over jargon. So, at first it was this argument between the customs union and a customs union, which is the argument between a transition period and an implementation period. So there's all of this jargon argument, and as far as I can see, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. So Labour have now introduced this phrase internal market, and in an attempt to further confuse things and muddy the water. So, my position and the position of the SNP is we should be in the single market and we should be in the customs union. Unless Labour Party come out, along the same lines, then we are on very different pages in this book, and it's quite difficult for us to be, that consistent voice against the Tories. We're doing what we think is the best thing for the people of Scotland, and actually for the people of the UK as a whole, to be fair. Labour have said that they're going to try and have this jobs first Brexit. Well, they're clearly not. If they were, they would be back in our position as well.
Has Labour been supportive in defending devolution, in your opinion?
I don't think Labour have been supportive enough in defending devolution. I think some of the noises that they made have been, relatively supportive. I think I'm concerned still about the power grab position and the fact that, I'm not sure. I hope Labour will vote with us in relation to that. I get the impression that they might, but I don't know. I think they've not been supportive enough. I think they could have shouted louder on this. It would have been helpful if they had, but actually I think people in Scotland know about the power grab, they know about the devolution issues because the SNP has been, making that case.
With the Sustainable Growth Commission bringing out their recommendations for post-independent Scotland on the economy, a lot of critics have pointed out that actually there's been a lot of divisiveness within the SNP and that there's been bickering. How would you characterise that yourself? Have you seen a lot of bickering or divisiveness in the SNP?
Do you know what? Going around conference, it doesn't feel like that at all. And it feels like people are actually talking about the economy more than they maybe would in the past. So, people in the SNP obviously believe in Scottish independence, and maybe previously we haven't focused on the economy to the extent that people are now. And saying to people, let's have this debate, let's talk about this over the course of the summer. And I said at a Fringe event yesterday, and I absolutely believe this, whether members agree with everything in the Growth Commission, whether they agree with nothing in the Growth Commission, or whether they agree with some of the Growth Commission, they should be getting in there and getting involved in the debates that we're going to have over the course of the summer. And it feels to me, going around conference, that even people that, disagree with some of the stuff in the Growth Commission are keen to get involved in that debate and keen to have those conversations. So I think that, although it has clearly picked a position on a number of things, actually that has generated debate rather than created division.
With the beginning of the conference, we saw YouGov and the Scottish Social Attitude Survey come out with some interesting data. They showed the SNP were on the up, they showed that independence was on the up, they showed that faith in the economy for independence was actually the highest rated option compared to all the other options that are available. So would you argue that the momentum is now behind the SNP and the Yes movement, or would you say they still got a fair bit to go until they cross the finish line to achieve independence?
It feels to me like the Growth Commission came out at exactly the right time. I mean, we have, since the Brexit vote, had the UK government taking stupid decisions, being unable to kind of take a position on some of the stuff, and clearly choosing the wrong economic direction in a number of different things. And the Growth Commission has come out now. David Davis and the Prime Minister have had some kind of showdown over the backstop in Northern Ireland. It feels like just as the UK government is completely falling apart, the SNP are having a really good, really knowledgeable, really informed discussion about the future of Scotland. I think, you mentioned the Scottish Social Attitude Survey. That could not be a more important piece of work. That particular figure in relation to how Scottish people living in Scotland, feel about the Scottish economy and whether or not it would be better off in an independent Scotland, that increase in that figure since 2014 is unbelievable. It's now sitting at 41%. It's now much higher than those who believe that the Scottish economy would be worse off under independence. And it feels to me like that's a real change in direction, like we've got real momentum here, and that we've managed to convince an awful lot of people. And if you think about it, the SNP have been in government in Scotland. The SNP, as I said in my welcome speech to conference, has been the fairest, most progressive government that there's ever been anywhere in these islands, and I genuinely believe that's the case. After, 10 years in government. 11 years in government. I was just thinking that. After 11 years in government, we're still at the situation where the SNP government is hugely popular, where it's delivering for the people of Scotland. That's unbelievable. That's not happened. That doesn't happen normally in other countries. So I think people are recognising that. They're recognising the fact that the SNP does deliver for the people of Scotland, and they're recognising the fact that independence would be beneficial for the people of Scotland.
Kirsty Blackman, thank you very much for joining us today at Broadcasting Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Stephen Gethins, thanks very much for joining us at Broadcasting Scotland. How effective can you be with 35 MPs in the face of Conservative determination to force through the Brexit bill, which will in effect change the terms of devolution?
Well, nowadays we're in a parliament of minorities at Westminster. This is something we've been quite used to in Holyrood, and actually it's something that's very normal in other European parliaments as well. And I think that gives us a responsibility to put forward positive suggestions and solutions. And there's also a responsibility on government to listen to the opposition. And that's something we've not seen very much of recently. But I think if we engage, we can be more constructive and we can win out a lot more, because those 35 SNP MPs giving a strong voice for Scotland is absolutely vital in any debate and cannot be ignored in any debate. So we're trying to work with other parties, find common ground where we can, but there needs to be a change in culture at Westminster, and that's not something I'm seeing at the moment. These old-fashioned divisions of the government just ignores the opposition, that can't go on. And so we need to see that culture change to reflect the change that the voters of the UK wanted to see.
Just touching on the culture you're talking about there, do you believe there's still hope that the Scottish Government and the UK Government can come to an agreement on the EU withdrawal bill?
There's absolutely hope, but there has to be respect for devolution. Now, one of our jobs as SNP MPs is to stick up for the devolution process, because we don't get that much support from the other parties for it. But there's also, if you look more broadly, there's no longer a majority for a really hard Brexit that ignores what the devolved administrations, not just in Scotland, but in Wales and Northern Ireland, would like to see. And we're using our influence positively to try and get that message across. But the election last year showed elsewhere in the United Kingdom, as well as in Scotland, a rejection of that hard Tory Brexit. That was the one clear message that came out of the general election.
You talked about other parties and the defence of devolution. So specifically on Labour, Have Labour been supportive in defence of devolution?
I think, to be fair, when you've seen the vote on the LCM in the Scottish Parliament, they got in behind the Scottish Government, and that was important. They've taken a different view on Wales, and we have to respect that. They've gone their own way there. At Westminster, I've put down a number of amendments along with Ian Blackford and other SNP MPs that protect the devolution process. I've asked Labour MPs to sign that amendment, and we'll see next week if they're going to be supportive or not. I will hope they will be. And if anybody's watching this and you've got a Labour MP, please encourage them to sign our amendments.
We know Labour have also put forward their own amendments to the EU withdrawal bill.
Yeah.
On those recent amendments, has Labour's position on Brexit become any clearer?
No. Now, we've got a government who are unclear from the start of the day to the end of the day on what their position is going to be, and it changes several times a day. And I think one of the great disappointments of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour movement at the moment is the fact that they should be holding this government to account in a much stronger way, but they're letting the Tories off the hook with a hard Brexit. And I'm sorry to say that, there are individual voices out there, but this opposition could be doing so much more. And one of the reasons why we're staring a hard Brexit, Tory Brexit in the face, is that Labour, who are the official opposition in Westminster, are not using their position more effectively to hold this government to account.
Stephen Gethins, SNP MP, thank you very much for your time. So David Linden, MP for Glasgow East, thanks very much for joining us at Broadcasting Scotland today. You are part of a campaign in Westminster to tackle wage discrimination for those under 25. Do you want to kind of develop or tell us more about this campaign and the issues that you face?
Yeah, essentially at the moment under the UK we have state-sanctioned pay poverty, so we've got a national living wage which is not actually a national living wage because it's a contract. The real national living wage is £8.75 per hour, whereas the UK government's at £7.50, so it does fall somewhat short. But the UK government's national living wage does not apply to under 25s. So what we see, for example, is under 25s who have the same costs when it comes to food bills, mortgages, fuel costs. They're not being paid an equal amount under the UK. So what I'm calling on the UK government to do is to bring forward a real national living wage for under 25s, and if they won't do it, then devolve the powers to Scotland, and we will.
There's maybe the argument that others may use to criticise your campaign to say, well, actually, by implementing maybe an equal wage for different age groups, it'll actually be higher costs for businesses, and therefore it just won't be affordable and may cause disruption within the markets. How would you kind of tackle that kind of criticism?
Well, I think it's very much the same as the argument that was proposed in the 1990s when the Labour government at the time brought forward the national minimum wage. I mean, people said that a national minimum wage would mean that businesses would struggle and the sky would fall in. That did not actually happen. I think the fundamental point is here that if you're a 16-year-old or a 26-year-old, you still have to pay the same amount for your food and your fuel. So, you know, if you're receiving or having to pay the same costs, then you should have the same sort of levels of income. You can't have a situation where you've got a 16-year-old joiner and a 26-year-old joiner being paid vastly different sums for doing the same job. It comes back to that simple premise that a fair day's work deserves a fair day's pay.
Is there examples of this working fairly well right now as it stands? Is there any programmes or is there any Scottish Government policy which is kind of leading the way as an example?
Yeah, so at the moment the Scottish Government has something called its Business Pledge. It has 9 key principles that it asks businesses to sign up to. 3 of those key principles, for example, are not using 0 hours contracts, investing in youth, and paying a national living wage to everybody regardless of age. That's a voluntary scheme, but what I want to see is the UK government bring forward legislation that makes it mandatory that under 25s are paid the same amount as the people who are over 25.
There might be another argument to say that actually maybe young people enjoy doing 0 hour contracts as we may see many people using them in real life. How would you counter that argument?
Well, as a constituency member of Parliament, I do surgeries every Friday, and I've never had a young person come to me and say, these 0 hours contracts are fantastic, it gives me lots of flexibility to choose between Wonga or other payday loans. The reality is that the 0 hour contract issue means that people have insecure work. It means that they don't have those legal protections in place, for example, when they're sick or when they need to take holiday. So my experience of 0 hours contracts and the people that I've spoken to in my constituency was a great many find it really quite insecure, and at a time when we have a fragile economy, 0 hours contracts are not helping that.
It's almost been a year today, I mean, just under that, where you have been elected as a new MP for Glasgow East, and it's your first time as an MP, your first year. What the experiences have you had being an MP? Have you learned anything? Have you maybe developed as an individual yourself? Tell us your kind of first year story.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been a remarkable year. Clearly, as a nationalist politician, I don't have any great desire to be at Westminster. I'm relished the day when I get my P45 as a result of the Scottish Independence Act being progressed through Westminster, and I get to come back home and go on with my life. But for so long as we have a Tory government that's intent on a hard Brexit and taking us over the cliff edge, then I'm quite happy to be part of that strong team of SNP MPs holding Theresa May to account, because one thing we see at the moment is Jeremy Corbyn is nowhere when it comes to the issue of Brexit. He's pretty much singing from the same hymn sheet. So this first year has been absolutely remarkable, just having that kind of ability to stand up and consistently say, stay in the single market, stay in the customs union, and ultimately let's get independence. And I think our time is coming. You
mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and Labour and Brexit. We know recently they put forward amendments to the EU withdrawal bill. Would you say those amendments actually made clear where Labour stand on the EU?
I think Labour's position on the European Union's as clear as mud. We've got Jeremy Corbyn, who frankly is a Eurosceptic. He's a pretty consistent record of being a Eurosceptic. And the idea that he's in the same party as Stephen Doughty or as Chuka Umunna, the Labour Party is in a really difficult position on this, because 2/3 of Labour seats at Westminster voted to leave in the European referendum. So they've got this balance between, they know that the Parliament's on a knife edge at the moment, the Parliament could collapse at any moment, we could have a general election, they're desperate to get into power, but equally they don't have a unified position on Brexit. And my prediction is that any snap election would be defined about Brexit, and at the moment the Labour Party have absolutely no position on that. They are at sea.
Do you have any memorable moments for your first year at Westminster?
I mean, I've got to say I was very, very honest with my constituency party when I got selected. I was never going to be an MP who wanted to be on Question Time and Newsnight and doing all the kind of high profile things. For me, the most important thing about being an MP is being in my constituency on the ground, being an ambassador for the SNP and for Scottish independence, but above all being an ambassador for my constituents. So some of the constituency cases that I've managed to get resolved as a result of being an MP, they are the most special moments. Really, really delighted with that.
We know the Sustainable Growth Commission has finally released a report, just about 2 weeks ago now, on the independence case for the economy. Many would argue that has caused a lot of division within the party, maybe from those on the left saying that actually it doesn't go far enough, should we be doing a lot more in terms of maybe currency or in terms of maybe spending or various different issues. How would you characterise that division yourself?
I wouldn't say so much as division, I think it's enthusiasm. I mean, I can't think of any political party that's brought forward a discussion document, because that is essentially what the Growth Commission is. It's a discussion document, and that will form the discussions that we have at national assemblies. But I can't think of any political party that's brought forward a discussion document like this and caused so much debate. I think debate's a really healthy thing within political parties. I know that we're here at the SNP conference where we're having card accounts, we're having disagreements, but we do that respectfully, and we do that because we've got passion to see a Scotland that has a strong economy, a Scotland that prospers. And I think the Growth Commission outlays a number of areas where we can do that. I wouldn't characterise it as division. I think debate is healthy. It's something we've been very good at in the SNP. And I think the people of Scotland like to see that. The fact that we've got this vision for an independent nation where other people's views are taken into account, I think it's only a good thing.
Do you have any personal views on the currency? Because we know the Growth Commission suggested the idea, they recommended the idea that Scotland, after independence, should keep the sterling in an unofficial kind of currency union, and maybe down the line consider a new currency. Do you have any formal position on that? Do you agree with that? Do you maybe?
No, I'm broadly relaxed about that. I mean, I would say that during the referendum in 2014, I was the campaign manager in Shettleston, and it's an area where there's not a lot of money washing around. And I remember the currency issue became a massive issue all across the country, and some people might say that because we didn't have that nailed down in 2014, that was why we didn't do so well. But I remember when that whole debate kicked off, going round doors in some of the poorest parts of my constituency, and people were saying, look, I don't have any money in my pocket at the moment, so I don't care what kind of currency it is. What we've got to do is persuade people that an independent Scotland will be a place where there is economic, prosperity for people, and I think people will warm to that. But I don't think the currency is a huge issue. But what's proposed in it at the moment, I'm pretty relaxed about, and that's a debate that we can have going forward.
And the final question, we know recent data that came out by YouGov and the Scottish Social Attitude Survey has been quite promising for maybe the Yes Movement and the SNP. The SNP from YouGov are increasing in the polls after 11 years in power. We know that when it comes to the faith in the economy post-independence, it has increased quite largely, almost double. Would you say the momentum is behind the SNP and the Yes Movement, or would you argue that actually there's still a fair bit to go to get over the finish line in order to achieve independence?
Oh, I mean, we've still got work to do, there's absolutely no doubt about that. But one of the things I've been quite clear about, and one of the things I've been pleasantly surprised about as a result of the Growth Commission has been, I speak to businesses every single day in my constituency, and a lot of those businesses along Shettleston Road and other parts of my constituency, when I was going in there in 2014 and saying, right, Jim, do you fancy voting for independence? Saying, well, I'm not quite so sure about that. What was interesting is that these exact same people are now turning around to me and saying, do you know what, son, I'll have another look at that again. The reality is the SNP's been in government for 11 years. You can't be, popular all the time. You've got to take tough decisions. But I think that the momentum that we've got at the moment where we're sitting in the polls is absolutely fantastic for a government that's been for 11 years. I think any government, including the last New Labour government, would have bit your hand off to be sitting at 40% in the polls 11 years into government. So we're doing really well. There's a lot of momentum at this conference, a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, and rightly so because we're well on our way to independence.
David Linden, MP for Glasgow East, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Mhairi Hunter, SNP Councillor for Glasgow, thank you very much for joining us today at Broadcasting Scotland at the SNP Conference. We're going to kick things off with the recent news that the Rolls Royce donated to Glasgow City Council was, according to sources from the Herald, was by Lloyd and a Labour councillor helped to make the deal happen. This has received quite various criticisms from critics, obviously. The idea that it will cost more to run the car, the idea that it looks bad to have a Rolls Royce and what it represents. How do you refute those comments?
Well, first of all, I would say there's been a lot of kind of politics around this, which I think is based on a misunderstanding of the kind of civic element of what councils do. This car, I'm not going to comment on who donated it because they did not want to be named, so I'm not going to name them. The person who donated the car donated it to the City of Glasgow. They didn't donate it to an SNP council. SNP councillors weren't asked about this. SNP councillors didn't know anything about it until it was announced because it was donated to the city. Now that's not unusual. People will donate things to the City of Glasgow to enrich the civic life of the city, and sometimes they don't want people to know their name. That's a protocol which exists and which has been used in this case. I think there have been people who've drawn certain conclusions around that, about why would somebody donate something to the SNP. It wasn't donated to the SNP, it was donated to Glasgow. There have been calls for transparency around it, referencing our manifesto, talking about transparency. What we're talking about there is political transparency. It's about decisions which are made by the political administration of the council. This wasn't a decision made by the political administration of the council.
Would you say that it's right that the person who donated this car should remain anonymous?
If that's their wish, yes. Yes, definitely.
And what about the argument, though, that for a working class city like Glasgow, it seems a little bit off to have a Rolls Royce for Glasgow City Council and the Lord Provost? People would say it represents something different, does not really represent the values of working class Glasgow.
Well, I was at the Gorbals Fair last weekend, and the Lord Provost was there with her gold chain, with her fancy car, with her chauffeur, and she actually gave a lift to the courtiers of the Prince and the Princess of the Gorbals. There are many working class communities which have, social events, which have fairs, which have other kinds of social events, and will have a civic dignitary there, be it the Lord Provost or be it one of the Baileys. They will arrive in a fancy car, they will have their gold chain, they will make a speech. This is part of our civic life. And I think it's just a bit kind of hair shirt to say no. I'm sorry, Glasgow, you're working class, you're not allowed to have fancy things, you're not allowed to have a civic life. this is how things are done and have always been done. I don't have a problem with it, you know.
One of the other topics that come out of Glasgow City Council is the increase in swimming lessons. And Labour have come out saying that this is hard for hard-pressed working families in Glasgow. How do you respond to it? And why is there a restructuring of prices going on just now?
Well, the first thing to say is that there isn't an end to free swimming. But we've looked again, or rather Glasgow Life has looked again at the whole pricing structure and the way they kind of provide services to try and, you know, maximise the number of people who are able to participate. So there was a policy of universal free swimming, but in practice that often meant that the children could get free swimming, the parents couldn't pay to go with them. So it was a little bit pointless. You know, it was an entitlement that many children couldn't use because their parents couldn't afford to go swimming with them. So we haven't ended free swimming. There will still be free swimming during school holidays and at weekends, which are, you know, those are the times that most people actually go swimming. But we've changed the pricing structure so that we've reduced the cost for parents so that they will now be able to accompany their children. And we've changed a lot of the pricing structures in that kind of way. I mean, I'm not going to go through all the changes, but, you know, some prices have gone up, other prices have gone down. It's about using the structure to try and make all of the services provided by Glasgow Life as accessible as possible.
When you're restructuring the prices for Glasgow City Council, was there a process involved when you spoke to parents, when you spoke to teachers?
Yeah.
Do you want to go into more detail about the process itself?
All of this was done by Glasgow Life, which was set up by previous administrations as an arm's length organisation. So they did a lot of very intensive work, working with their customers and also working with consultants who helped them to put together a proposal. And as I say, it's all focused on actually increasing the number of people using the services provided by Glasgow Life by changing the pricing structure. So yes, people are focusing on some things which have gone up in price, but equally there are other things which have gone down in price. So you need to look at the totality of the reform, I think, rather than just one particular aspect of it.
Another big issue that Glasgow City Council are facing is the costs for previous administrations for trying to take on equal pay for a lot of working women.
Yeah.
How is Glasgow, what is the cost that Glasgow City Council faces with these prices? And secondly, how are you going to tackle them?
We don't have a cost at this point in time. You'll see various costs floating around. The reality is we don't know at this point in time. We're engaged in negotiations with staff representatives, and I think that will still be going on for quite a number of months. At the end of that, we will come up with a cost. There'll be a cost for a settlement for equal pay. There'll also be a cost for ensuring that our pay and grading structures don't perpetuate the problems of that have led to this case being brought. At this point in time, we can't put a figure on it.
Is that not even an estimate at all? Or
I'm not going to give an actual figure because we just can't say that at this point in time. It will be significant, but I'm not going to put an actual figure on it. But we're already looking at how we're going to be able to manage that. What I can say is that we will manage it without it being taken from frontline services. It will be done in terms of borrowing. It won't be taken out of frontline services. It will be extremely challenging, but I think we'll get support from and advice from other sources about how to manage that.
On social media, you're a great advocate for transgender rights and the issues that many people who are transgender face. Now, I'm a straight white male. I'm not going to lie, I do not know a lot of the issues faced by transgender individuals. So if it's okay with you, would you be able to expand on the issues they face and what more authorities can do to help with individuals within the, not even like just transgender, but within the LGBTQI plus spectrum?
Well, I am a straight white female, so I didn't.
More informed than me, though.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't start off with any kind of particular insight into transgender issues, but it's become one of these hot topics on social media, and I find it interesting that there's been my perception as somebody who's a counsellor, as somebody who's a member of an integration joint board, sits on a health board. So I kind of have the perspective, I think, that we as providers of healthcare, as providers of public services, we need to provide healthcare and services to people in a way that works for them and in a way which respects their individual autonomy. So there are a minority of people who are transgender. They are a fairly small minority, and I think I can understand how people think, how can you change gender, because it's something that's quite difficult for me to understand, but you need to simply just respect the fact that that's how people feel, and we need to accommodate that in terms of how to provide basic service to them, and what's being proposed in legislative terms is really almost a kind of administrative change. It's about making it easier for people to change their birth certificates. There's a huge amount of focus on the idea of self-ID, of people being able to declare their gender, essentially, even if that's not what's on their birth certificate. That already happens in a great many settings. It happens within the health service. It happens within other public services. It happens within areas like women's refuges, for example, or rape crisis service. So a lot of the concerns that are raised about it actually refer to things which already happen. So it's kind of a strange debate that people are saying, if this law is passed, it will mean that a transgender woman would be able to access help from a women's refuge when they already can, so there's a level of kind of unreality about it. I'm not saying that there aren't any issues. I think there are issues, particularly around the prison estate. I think that's something that will need a lot of work. But there is something about the debate which is slightly unreal for me, given that it's, people are talking about things which may happen in the future, which in fact already happened,
Final question, and it's on the recent data that came out by YouGov and the Scottish Social Attitude Survey. YouGov found that the SNP have increased in the polls, and it's shown they can get over 40 seats in the Westminster election and would increase their support at a Hollywood election. And the Attitude Survey found that there's huge support for Scottish independence and especially its economy in comparison to the status quo or people who are not sure. Would you say then that the momentum is behind the SNP going forward and the Yes movement? Or would you argue instead that actually, while this is good, there's still a fair bit to go until the SNP and the Yes movement achieve independence?
I think both. I think that we have got momentum. I mean, we're the only ones making the arguments, and I think Scottish independence remains the biggest argument in Scottish politics. But I also think we've got a bit more to do. I think we've got a huge amount more to do in terms of going forward to the next referendum. I have no idea when that's going to be. I don't think anybody does at this stage. But we know what we have to do. We have to increase support for independence. There's absolutely nothing that says we need to know the date of the referendum before we do that. So certainly in my branch we're out canvassing. I would hope that everybody's out canvassing, and talking to people about independence. I think the Growth Commission report is a fantastic resource for that. Whether or not you agree with every single thing that's in it, it's a fantastic foundation for having conversations with people, and also for us in the Yes movement to kind of stop arguing about slightly trivial things, and really get into the kind of meat of what independence is about.
Mhairi Hunter, SNP Councillor from Glasgow, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Lloyd Melville, young activist, thanks for joining us. Melville. Apologies.
Don't worry about it, happens all the time.
I'll start off better next time. Thank you for joining us, Broadcasting Scotland. You were on Question Time quite recently, actually.
That is indeed true,
and you made quite a passionate point on the timing of an independence referendum. Would you want to repeat the point you made beforehand and maybe expand upon it?
Well, yeah, I mean, we know what the First Minister said. That is all I said to start with. And these people who are like, when are you going to have it? When are you going to have it? When are you going to have it? We know when we're going to have it. There's been a timescale laid out. It's going to be between autumn of this year and spring of next year. And the First Minister will make her decision in the autumn of this year as to when that is going to be held.
So there's the two kind of views on the timing of a referendum. There's one when it will be held and one when it should be held. So Nicola Sturgeon has a view that it should be held between the date you just gave. Now, is that both what you think when it should be held and your personal opinion?
Oh, well, I think we need independence as soon as possible. I also agree with the First Minister's point when she says that we need to know what Brexit is going to look like. And further going back to what you said about Question Time, the point I made on Question Time was we need to know what the Britain is going to look like that we would be staying in if that's what we chose. So we need to know, I mentioned EU on Question Time, here I'm going to mention devolved powers because I forgot to on Question Time. We need to know if they're going to impose legislation on us whenever they see fit. We need to know if they're planning to take away the Scottish Parliament. We need to know these things, and the sooner that we know these things, and the sooner that we know the impact that Brexit is going to have on our economy and on our sort of social structures and things like that, that is when we'll have the referendum.
As a young person yourself, what got you involved to help out with the SNP? And were you part of any other groups beforehand? Or
I was actually until sort of this time 2017. I was Labour. Yeah, I know. I was Labour, but I defected, if you like, to the SNP after Brexit because I sort of saw the position that Mr Corbyn took with Brexit, and it was so inconsistent. And they just sort of didn't really know what they were doing, and then I looked at the independence question again, and I thought to myself, well, there's a viable other option. So just looking at the results of Brexit, Scotland obviously, we know, it's been said so many times, voted overwhelmingly to remain, but we're being ignored in the talks and things like that. So I feel like, and I felt like then, and I still feel like now, we need to have that other opportunity, and that's why I joined the SNP, just because they're the vehicle of independence, and that is what people should realise. People who, maybe are in Labour and voted yes, they need to realise Labour will never give us an independence referendum. The SNP are the only party, them and the Greens, I should say. The Greens do really good work as well. The SNP and the Greens are the only parties that will ever have a referendum on the cards.
So it's quite clear that you're a big supporter of Scottish independence.
Oh, clearly.
Yeah. What is it about Scottish independence you like? What is your main reason for supporting it? Or many reasons why you support it?
Without wanting to revert to the William Wallace cliche, it's about freedom. The freedom for our country to pursue its own goals and its own bespoke policies. Because we've seen, just even say in the last few months, how Westminster policies have directly affected Scotland in a negative way. For example, the hostile environment policy, and the rape clause and things like that. Well, things that people don't really pull Westminster up about, apart from the magnificent SNP group in Westminster, and of course the First Minister herself. But it's about freedom, and it's also about democracy. I know people will be like, it's not democratic to keep having referendums. We have a general election every 5 years. People change their minds. It's what people do. And there is a mandate for it. That mandate was given to Nicola Sturgeon in 2016, and that's what I think we need to remember.
when we look at polls and we show the demographics of support for independence, most young voters, by a large margin, back Scottish independence.
Yes.
As a young person yourself, is there an explanation for it? Are young people just more optimistic about the future, or is there more to it?
Yeah, no, I would say young people as a whole are more optimistic about the future. But young people can see that in the Westminster system, it's not for them. We don't have votes at 16 and 17 in general elections. So that's a massive part of the populace that's cut off by conservative policies. And really, I think the whole thing is it's about wanting themselves. It sounds selfish, but what we as young people, if I don't seek to speak for all young people, but I know certainly me, I want a better future. Because in this current climate, the way things are going, I might not have a good future. And I know there are so many other people that are worried about being worse off than their parents. They're going to pass massive debts to their children and things like that because of not only Brexit, but austerity, which is horrific. And I think generally young people are more radical in a way than older people, and that's why they want change.
You mentioned Brexit, and obviously if you look at the same demographics for support for Brexit,
yes,
young people are heavily opposed to it. But as a young person, again, yourself, what is your main reason for being opposed to Brexit? There is also the argument at the same time that maybe you support, you don't want London to rule you, but you want Brussels to rule you, which is a kind of an argument here from Leave voters.
That's an empty argument.
Why would you say that? First of all, why are you opposed to Brexit? And then you can maybe go on to that argument.
Firstly, I'm opposed to Brexit because I have and always will be European. That only comes second to my Scottish identity. I don't see myself as British in any way. That and I think the benefits of EU membership overwhelmingly outweigh the negatives. And the EU is not a perfect institution. There's no institution that is perfect. We know this. But we need to remember that 62% of Scotland voted to remain in the EU, and we're being ignored on that. So I think that as itself highlights, or it's a main reason for young people, like why are we not being spoken about? Why are we not involved in things that we voted to remain a part of? And so yeah.
You mentioned earlier votes at 16 for a lot younger voters yourself.
Yes.
You were cut off from the general election and
the snap election in
2017.
Yep.
How do you feel about that in general? Do you feel that 6-year-olds should have the right to vote at 16, and if so, why?
Well, I feel that way because it makes society more open and democratic. It often feels to me that Westminster is trying to put a muzzle over our young people, and that is democratically unacceptable, to coin a phrase that I think Nicola Sturgeon used after Brexit as well.
I can't confirm that, but
I think she did. She might have not have done. But no, I mean, we've got to remember that young people are the future, and the earlier that we get them engaged in politics, the better for our country, because I feel like there's a lot of negativity towards young people, and it's completely uncalled for. And the sooner that we get them engaged in the political process, then the better decisions that we can make in the future.
Lloyd Melville, young activist, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Roger Mullin, thanks for joining us again. I spoke to you 2 weeks ago at your lovely place in Kirkcaldy.
That's right.
And we were talking about the Growth Commission. 2 weeks later, I believe, we were discussing the Growth Commission and the reaction to it. Now that you've had 2 weeks, what do you think of the recent reaction to it? Do you think it's had good debate and good engagement, or do you feel like it's been a bit more divisive? How do you evaluate it?
Well, I think for 90% of the contributions, I would say, that I've seen and heard about, and the contacts I've had, are all people who want to seriously engage with the issues, and that is exactly as we hope. And so there's a debate around a number of areas in particular, and that's all to the good. There's about 10%, I would say, 5% in the fringe this way and 5% in the fringe that way, that are just engaging in the typical yaboo stuff, which doesn't really interest me at all, but they're not engaging in the substance of the argument. So I would say for 90% of the engagement that I've seen, it's been exactly as I would have hoped. Serious, thoughtful and purposeful discussion.
It's also been interesting seeing the amount of academics have come out and had a discussion about the Growth Commission. We had Bill Mitchell from Australia, who's an economist, saying that he did disagree with quite a lot of the report, but he had his own suggestions for independence. Is that quite promising, seeing academics come out from different backgrounds, giving different ideas to independence, supporting it, showing that actually this is really engaged, not just normal people, but academia as well?
Absolutely. And the way in which the Growth Commission positioned some of the arguments, it opened up a field for people to make constructive suggestions. I mean, if you take, for example, the ideas around tax, we need to simplify the tax system, but we need to make it much more efficient in gathering in tax. What does that do? That opens up a debate about what should the tax system actually look like, so that you're getting people on the one side who would argue strongly for a land value tax, and you get people arguing for other approaches to that. But the good thing is, what it's done is it's opened people up. What people have noticed, and just to take that one example, have not been denying, is the Growth Commission position that we need to simplify and become more efficient and clearer about the purpose of taxation. Nobody's disagreeing with that. What they're doing now is contributing the way in which we'd achieve that. And that's all to the good.
2 weeks ago, should I say, not last week, 2 weeks ago, you were pretty blunt and brutal towards Richard Leonard by saying that he was economically illiterate, which I'm sure hurt his heart a fair bit. But recently Labour have had their own amendments to the EU withdrawal bill. Do you believe that Labour are a bit more clear now on their position on the EU? And would you say that maybe they're not so illiterate overall?
Well, I wish that were true, because I'm genuinely extremely concerned about what's coming down the track as regards Brexit. There was a gentleman that some people who engaged in the 2014 independence debate will remember, perhaps not very kindly, Nick McPherson, who was the senior Treasury official at the time. And the interesting thing is he had a tweet out, I think it's in the last 48 hours, where he said, from his position, that the UK has never been as badly served by both the Conservatives and the Labour Party in their attitude towards Brexit, because neither of them have a coherent position. And that remains the case. So, in one sense, it's worse than incoherence. It is chaos. We are literally, they're having us living in the edge of chaos at the moment, and that serves nobody very well. So just half an hour ago, I had a brief chat with Mike Russell, and I was telling Mike that some of the senior business people I've been talking with in the last week have been, even those that are not ideologically of a similar bent as myself and Mike, were saying that they admired the way in which he had done his homework, had developed a coherent position, and was presenting that forcibly, something that is entirely lacking through the Westminster bubble, entirely lacking in the government. We saw last night Boris Johnson effectively saying with some glee, this is all heading for complete catastrophe, but it'll be okay in the end, you know. And we've got the continuing division in the Labour Party. On the one hand, how close do we get to the single market without being in it? And we know that Corbyn and some of them have very reactionary views as to why they don't want to be in a single market. And that's because of the people element. They don't want freedom of movement of people.
So you were touching on the impact there of Brexit. Do you want to kind of develop that point a little further from your view, because you've spoken to many individuals who run businesses themselves and done studies on it. How would you see the impact of Brexit on Scotland on the short and long term?
Right. Well, the one thing that is very clear is that although I've always been encouraging businesses to do as much planning and preparation as they can, in a lot of areas they can't do detailed planning. All they can do is prepare themselves for uncertainty. So that, for example, we still don't know what the customs arrangements are going to be. That affects every single trading company in Scotland, right? We don't know what the tariffs are going to be, the trading arrangements and the like. So part of the immediate problem once we exit the EU in what is less than a year from now is that people who are in very important positions for making decisions that affect the economy are left in a complete limbo at the moment. A limbo of a combination of uncertainty, and also added to that there is the complexity that's involved that the UK government are showing no interest in unpicking, helping people to see through the different complex arrangements that are going to have to be set in place. Now, what does that mean in terms of the short and the long term? In the short term, the government is talking about itself having a 21-month implementation or transitional period, right? That is not going to be possible for many business sectors in Scotland. They're going to need anything from 3 to 5 years to transition a lot of the changes that are going to take place. So we're going to be trying to transition the economy for a long time. And at the moment, transitioning it to what? To an unknown destination. So the problem is there's not only going to be effect in the short run, right, where there's uncertainty, but there's going to be a lot of problems in terms of what I would call the medium term, that is 5 to 10 years. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't see where we're going to be 10 years from now, other than we do know that it is highly likely that the growth of the UK economy altogether is going to be much lower than it otherwise could be because of the chaotic Brexit.
Do you think there could be a recession down the line?
I think that is highly likely. I couldn't put an absolute timescale on it, but if you were asking me to take out a £10 note and put a bet on it, I would put a bet on, there is going to be a recession at some time, not too far into the future, given the way in which Brexit is impacting things.
Roger Mullin, thank you very much for joining us again at Broadcasting Scotland. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It was wonderful having been had by you again.
Dr. Philippa Whitford, health spokesperson at Westminster for the SNP, thank you very much for joining us today at Broadcasting Scotland.
You're very welcome.
Yesterday at the SNP conference, what we saw was solidarity and a resolution for the victims in Palestine, and specifically in Gaza, should I say. Why is this motion very important to the SNP?
Well, sometimes people feel that expressing support for people who are being victimised elsewhere in the world is pointless. But I always remember the comments of Nelson Mandela when he said that the support that came from Glasgow when he was in prison, how much that meant to him. And when I was out in Gaza in September, the people are despairing. I mean, they literally see nothing of a future, and they feel that they've been abandoned by the international community. So I think having a formal resolution that expresses our concern at the violence that has been going on, the number of injured, the people injured by high-velocity weapons through snipers, and the ramifications of that. The fact that the UK government expressed in Parliament support for an investigation into how all this happened, and then abstained in the UNHRC. So, I think that there's several things that we need, and it's important that as a party who believes in social justice, both here and in the world, that we express that.
You said you were in Gaza. Do you want to talk a bit more about what you witnessed there and your personal experience?
Well, I worked as a volunteer in Gaza back in the early 90s for about 16 months, and once I became an MP, I met up again with Medical Aid for Palestinians. That's who I'd worked for. So I went out in April 16 and then out in September last year. And what I saw was really appalling treatment for women with breast cancer, which is my specialty before I became an MP. And we wanted to try and do something about that. So we're now running a project linking specialists from all over Scotland with doctors in the West Bank and Gaza. So I'll be going out kind of once a year. Now, when you get into Gaza, the first thing that hits you is the smell of sewage. I mean, the stench is appalling. And that's because over several sites, raw sewage is just pouring out into the sea, even though fish and seafood is one of the kind of key economic industries in Gaza. Obviously, it is completely under blockade and has been for 11 years. So it's very difficult to get materials and things into Gaza. That includes drugs, but it also includes building materials. So a lot of the houses and apartments that were destroyed by the 2014 invasion are still not rebuilt. There's still people who are homeless now and have been homeless since 2014.
How have we gotten to this point then in our history? What are the background events that's brought us here?
Well, I was working in Gaza when the peace process that some people may remember, the Oslo Accords, started in 91. And I remember in the morning we had a lot of violence and a lot of casualties into the hospital. And I thought the whole strip was going to go up. But by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we looked out from the balcony of intensive care and we could see young men in the streets climbing up on armoured cars and giving olive branches to Israeli soldiers. They literally thought their lives were going to change. And the problem is the international community just drifted away and started doing other things. They never followed through. And more than a quarter of a century on, what shocks me is how much worse conditions are. And obviously people are literally trapped in this kind of 5 by 25 mile strip. There's 2 million people squashed into that space with no drinking water of any quality, 4 hours of electricity a day, and obviously raw sewage just pouring out into the sea. So, I mean, the humanitarian conditions are awful, and the UN predict that it will not meet the standard for being habitable by 2020.
Is there a solution to solve this crisis?
There's no easy solution at all, and if there was, it would have been solved. But the problem at the moment is the issue of Israel and Palestine isn't even on the international agenda. And in the meantime, what's happening is settlements are just expanding rapidly across the West Bank. So what we're seeing is conquest by concrete. And then people talk about the facts on the ground. So Palestinians are gradually being, if you like, almost corralled into smaller and smaller areas in the West Bank. It's almost like Indian reservations. So you end up that you don't have a viable area of the West Bank that would be considered the basis for a Palestinian state. Now, officially the UK believes in a two-state solution, but we're not actually doing anything to argue and defend for the protection of the West Bank so that the building blocks of a Palestinian state are there. And the UK still hasn't recognised Palestine as a state. How can you have a two-state solution if you don't recognise both states?
Other issues that have been raised at conference obviously surround mainstream issues like Brexit, health and immigration, and you're obviously a keen advocate for your party's point of view. Do you want to explain how all three topics somewhat link in together? That's immigration, health and Brexit.
Well, I think many people, and certainly the UK government, for the first year or so after the referendum, I think we're just focused on the impact on trade. I think they're still largely focused on the impact of Brexit on trade and not recognising that over 40 years we have developed all of these agencies and areas of cooperation, and they're going to be much harder to replace. So, you know, one of the first big impacts is the loss of EU staff from our health service. So 14% of EU doctors in Scotland are in the process of leaving. 35% in total are considering leaving because 2 years on they don't feel secure. And particularly after Windrush, they don't feel their children are secure. And that is a really big issue. And that is even worse when you start to get into social care, where there's a higher proportion of social care workers who are from Europe and particularly Eastern Europe. Things like our EHIC card, which allows us to get medical treatment anywhere in Europe if we were travelling on holiday and have an emergency. It also allows someone with really complex conditions to go on holiday. So someone even needing dialysis or ongoing treatment would be able to access that. People will not be able to replace that with a health travel insurance that they could cover. Our pensioners get to retire to the south of Spain because they can transfer their healthcare rights where they paid tax in the UK to where they're going to receive healthcare. All of these things disappear. And then you've got something like the European Medicines Agency, where a new drug is licensed once for the whole of Europe. It happens at virtually the same time as America because Europe is such a big market. we're now going to become a smaller market. And therefore, there's likely to be a 6-month or 1-year delay for new drugs launching here, as there is for Australia and Canada. They don't get access to new cancer drugs at the time that we do in the UK. So there's all of these impacts, and it took a very long time to get them on the agenda because none of this was discussed before the referendum. And so while people are walking around the streets thinking, I'm not a business person, I don't do exporting, this isn't going to affect me, in actual fact it'll affect everyone. And where it comes around immigration, we still don't know what either the EU nationals who already live here will face to achieve settled status, what protection their children will have, but also what about EU nationals who want to come in the future? There's absolutely no clarity around that. And what we've seen since the Brexit vote is a 90% drop in EU nurses registering to come to the UK. Now, at a time when all 4 health services face real challenges over workforce, it's absolutely crazy that we're losing such a source of excellent colleagues. And then on top of that, the Home Office, with their hostile environment, are turning away doctors. They've turned away over 1,500 non-EU doctors who actually had jobs in the UK. And the hospital then applies for a certificate of sponsorship to get a visa, and they've turned these down at a time, again, when health services are crying out for doctors. So this, EU nationals not wanting to come because they feel unwelcome, and then non-EU nationals not being able to come because you're talking about this hostile immigration environment. So all of these are going to come together and create enormous challenges for our NHS services.
So in your opinion, what could be the alternative to avoid such a Brexit scenario?
Well, obviously, as an SNP politician, it's relatively clear to me that Scotland should be making its own decisions. We would never have made this decision. At the very least, Scotland would need control over immigration. Because while I'm talking about the health and care sector, there will be the university sector, the industry sector, but in actual fact, Scotland needs people of working age and young people who are having families and children. Otherwise, we have a fall in working age population. So that's an absolute existential threat to Scotland if we are going to be hampered by this obsession with numbers that Westminster has. But to me, in 2014, people saw the status quo or the continuing UK as the motorway going straight down the road. That's the easy way to go. And Scottish independence looked like turning off into a side road. Oh, what will it mean? Well, there is no status quo anymore. So Scotland's actually coming up to a fork in the road where there will be change and uncertainty down both roads. The difference about going for independence is we'll be in the driving seat. We'll be making the decisions. And Brexit is a decision we would never have made. And when you add on top of that the power grab, that they're trying to take powers over things like food standards and agricultural standards to Westminster instead of coming from Europe to here. This is all about trading away the crown jewels of Scotland to get an American trade deal. So we're in a position where if we don't actually go forward and start making our own decisions, we're actually going to end up going backwards because devolution is going to get rolled back.
Dr. Philippa Whitford, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Tommy Sheppard MP, thank you very much for joining us today on Broadcasting Scotland. Let's touch on Gaza. The SNP moved a motion showing solidarity for the Palestinians that lost their life in Gaza. Why is this motion important?
Well, I think it's important because people have to stand up and be counted. And I'm very shocked indeed that the UK government hasn't condemned the Israeli Defence Forces and effectively the executions that have taken place of unarmed protesters on the Gazan border. I'm very pleased that almost unanimously the SNP delegates decided to make that condemnation. And we now have to press that home with the UK government and make sure that they join forces with other people in the world and most of the countries in the world trying to rein in the excesses of the Israeli armed forces and trying to get a proper peace process back off the ground.
Were you yourself in Gaza during a time period with the UK government?
No, I've never been to Gaza. It's very, very difficult to get into Gaza. My colleague Philippa Whitford, who moved the motion, she has been there on medical exchange working in the hospitals in Gaza, and she was able to get in on that basis. It was very, very difficult for ordinary people to get in. I have been to the occupied West Bank on 4 occasions, which of course is nearby and faces very similar problems and is also part of the Palestinian equation.
Let's talk about the solutions to it. Do you think there could be a solution in long term, or is there problems based from other governments intervening?
Well, I mean, I'm still hanging by my fingernails to the concept of a two-state solution, that there should be a democratic state of Israel and a democratic state of Palestine living side by side, mutually recognizing and respecting each other and living in peace. That is the long-term objective. That's the objective that the United Nations wants. And every time anybody has tried to look at this most intractable of problems in the world, that is what they've come up with. So I'd still like to see that happen. The problem is that the Israeli government doesn't seem to wish that to happen anymore. They wish to continue occupying the lands that were set aside for the Palestinian state and having them under the control of Israel. And if they continue with that, then inevitably the demand will shift from the demand for a Palestinian state to rights and access for Palestinians within Israel itself. And in many ways that's going to force more changes to the current state of Israel than acceding to the demand for a Palestinian state.
Let's move on to the big theme of Brexit just now. Do you believe that Brexit is a threat to devolution? And if so, why?
Well, I believe it needn't be inherently a threat to devolution. I mean, I'm against Brexit, but there would be ways of doing it that would respect the devolution settlement. For example, as we repatriate powers from Brussels, we could just directly bring those powers that relate to the matters in Scotland that are under the control of Scottish Parliament. We could bring them straight to Edinburgh. And my phone is going again.
It's fine, don't worry.
Sorry. If you just ignore that, we'll try and cut it. So, I mean, there might be a way of doing Brexit where you could respect devolution and bring the powers straight to Holyrood. That's not what's happening. The UK government is using Brexit as a vehicle to centralise a lot of powers to itself, and in particular to bring in arrangements which will constrain the operation of the Scottish Parliament. And that's why we are concerned about the power grab aspect of it, but of course we're concerned about the entirety of Brexit as well. It's going to be very bad for Scotland.
Has Labour done enough, in your opinion, to defend devolution?
Well, I mean, they have sided with the SNP in the Scottish Parliament, and as have the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. So 4 out of the 5 parties in the Scottish Parliament are united in that, and that breadth of political consensus sort of by itself would suggest that the UK government ought to get back around the negotiating table on this. Labour, so I accept and acknowledge the support of the Labour Party in the Scottish Parliament. I think, though, in the House of Commons, Labour needs to do a lot more to stand up against a hard Brexit that's being proposed by the Tory right.
Final question, and it's in the very beginning of this conference when data came out by YouGov and the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, finding that actually support for independence is on the rise, the SNP support is also on the rise in both Westminster and Holyrood. Do you believe that the SNP and the Yes movement have the momentum to achieve independence, or is there still a fair bit to go?
Well, I think we've been through a very difficult period of treading water, of trying to adjust after the 2014 defeat, and we're now coming out of that cycle. And of course, matters have been dominated by Brexit, which has caused the most chaos and confusion I've ever known in politics.
But you're very popular, it seems.
I think that's my taxi, but we're coming out of that, and we're in good shape. And I think as the dust settles on Brexit at the turn of the year, we will get some traction, and we will be able to move forward with the next phase of our journey.
Great. Tommy Sheppard, I'll let you go, but thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Matt Campbell, National Convener for English Scots for Yes, thanks very much for joining us here.
Lovely to have you.
I want to discuss with you more about the organisations you represent. As I said before, English Scots for Yes. There's all these kind of ideas that within the SNP movement it's maybe anti-English because they want independence away from the rest of the UK. And how would you tackle that kind of argument or that kind of claim?
Well, first off, it's nonsense. The SNP is factually not in any way anti-English. Not only would the party expel members for being anti-English, the party has English members by the score, by the dozen, by the hundreds. The party's deputy leader, last but one, was English. The party has English MSPs, the party has English MPs. I was an English councillor, I'm not a councillor now, but I was an English SNP councillor, so the party is demonstrably not anti-English. In terms of why the English, the idea that English people are somehow being pushed away from by Scotland in the Scottish independence question, I think that's largely a narrative that certain right-wing media outlets have pushed because it's a good story to sell. And the reason I think that is because during the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, our group, English Scots VS, we were very active, and we got dozens of media requests for interviews and stories and attention from media from all across the world, apart from Scotland. I had multiple interviews on BBC radio stations in England, yet never BBC Radio Scotland, because they didn't want to push that narrative in Scotland, because the idea was that if you were for independence, you're anti-English. So having an English group that are pro-independence doesn't fit the story, and news editors like to make sure the story makes sense.
Tell us more about English Scots for Yes, about maybe it's a little bit of a brief history on it. What do you do within the party? What's the feeling right now within the group? Is it getting bigger? Is it getting smaller?
We are expanding rapidly. To give you some history, we founded in 2014, just before the referendum. Originally because, like I said, I was an SNP councillor at the time, and I thought, what can I give the independence cause that's unique? Well, I'm a vocal English person that's for independence, so I'll go to the English for Yes group and give them my help, only to find there wasn't one. So if not me, who? So I established a group along with some other people. We got the ball rolling, we started to gather some support, we did some events, we had a tea party down on the border to show the laughability of having a border with England that's somehow a hard border. And after that we kind of started rolling from there. We didn't stop at the referendum, and we're growing in members. I think we currently have around 1,700 members. We're hoping to grow that to about 5,000 before the next independence referendum, whenever that might be. And we've just recently, in the last 2 weeks, we established a group in Dumfries and Galloway. So we now have a regional group in Dumfries and Galloway, and we're hoping to start more regional groups up across the country. We've got a couple now. So we're hoping to regionalise our group more to help really campaign on the doorsteps and on the ground. When people are going to doors and they get someone that says, oh, I don't want to vote for independence because I'm English, and you're just all anti-English English people, or we can have someone standing going, hi, I'm English, and I think independence for Scotland's a good reason because I live in Scotland and I want Scotland to be the best country it can be. I want it to be a fairer, wealthier, more equal society.
Tell us more about the demographics of English Scots for Yes, or maybe the wider demographics for like voting intentions, because others may argue that the majority of English people in Scotland would vote no, but I mean, whilst that is the case, it's not entirely true in the sense that actually it's not just an English demographic.
Well, no, that's very true. The English for Yes group, we have a wide demographic across all parties. We have Tories, we have Liberals, we have Labour, we have Greens, we have SNP, and many members from no party at all. But the wider demographic of people who are born in England yet live in Scotland, it's actually a skewed demographic that veers heavily towards a much older subset than the general population. I suspect because a lot of older retirees have retired to Scotland, to a place in the country sort of thing, and that skews that yes-no voting demographic because a lot of older voters have an emotional attachment to the union that younger people take a more reasoned stance and look at how it might affect them. Older voters tend to just vote with their gut feeling that Britain's what they've grown up with. So I think that the amount of people that voted no who are English and were born in England and live in Scotland, I think a lot of that's purely down to the fact that they're older voters, and we know a lot of older voters in Scotland voted no. 70% of them, in fact, over 65s. Likewise, 70% of English people voted no. So I think that's more that demographic than specifically English people don't want independence. I think a lot of English people do want independence. It's just that the demographic is massively skewed towards them older voters. I mean, there's 490 plus thousand English-born people in Scotland. So if that group had voted for independence, we would likely be independent. But that isn't really the critical thought, because we're all Scots, no matter where we were born. We all live in Scotland. We all want what's best for the country.
Tell us more about your personal role within English Scots Press. What is it you do to help run the organisation, really?
I'm the co-founder, national convener, and chief pot washer. So I do a lot of the day-to-day stuff, like making sure we've got enough T-shirts and ordering new badges. and I also help coordinate policy and drive the organisation forward, helping support smaller groups that want to campaign with English Scots for Yes people, and helping to found the smaller groups that are English Scots groups across Scotland. So I take a kind of administrative role. We do have a national committee that we're in the middle of forming, that's going to have a couple of MSPs on it and some other notable faces that will help drive that policy direction forwards. I suspect I'll probably still be washing the pots.
Matt Campbell, thanks very much for joining us today from Broadcasting Scotland.
Thanks very much. Pleasure being here.
Jessiman, National Council member, thank you very much for joining us today with Broadcasting Scotland. You used to be part of an organisation called New Scots. Can you tell me more about what New Scots are, or what they were and what they stood for?
New Scots were people who were born out with Scotland, but who supported the independence movement. We were set up back in the mid-90s, and the brief we were given really was to try and separate in people's minds the ideas of racism and nationalism, that nationalism wasn't a racist thing. We had about 500 members, some 2/3 of which were English, and like myself, and we succeeded. I don't think you hear that very often these days. I think people have accepted that the SNP and the independence movement is inclusive.
Do you think the SNP have become more inclusive over the years?
I think they always have been. I think the only thing that's altered, I think, within the independence movement is just the number of people, the number of people who are now SNP members. But I think I have to say that the party will not tolerate that any kind of exclusive remarks, attitudes, behaviour. Anybody who has ever tried it has been thrown out.
Do you want to tell us more about what you do within the Yes movement itself currently, and what you do as an activist?
Yes, as an activist, I work with the Yes movement. I'm not actually. My work is purely political. I'm within the SNP format. Basically, the work that I do for most of the time is my constituency association raises its funds by taking a stall round the agricultural shows of the north and northeast, because that's where we can get high contact with members of the public. And I have for 10 years run a stall which talks about independence to the public, and we work on the basis of getting people themselves, the voters, to talk about why they support independence, or rather, in the last few years, talking to know people, talking to them about what bothers them about independence. We work on the material of talking that. At the end of each season, we do a sort of survey to see what subjects the public has brought up with us most often. I research that during the winter, and we produce the material for the following year on what the public has actually told us.
So what are the big issues then that are raised by the public in your survey?
For over 10 years, they have consistently raised the subjects of pensions, of money, by which they mean currency, and the economy. At the beginning, they mentioned defence, but that seems to have got lost somewhere along the way.
Do you have an opinion on currency and how an independent Scotland should go forward?
Well, funnily enough, I work at the moment mainly on providing information, because one of the things that hits anybody between the eyes that talks to voters for any length of time is simply how ignorant they are of the actual machinery, the structure, who does what, and how. And so I've been producing leaflets. I looked at the three major options and went back to government sources to look at the euro, sterling, and just put the facts down. I was quite interested when I came to look at the question of the Scottish pound, for example. I looked at about 8 different academic sources, experts, and needless to say, they all slightly disagreed with one another, as experts tend to do. But there were certain things on which they agreed, and I thought that the critical one was the fact that they agreed that an independent currency was the best tool that a Scottish government could have for controlling and managing the economy. And I felt that that being the case, with a new state starting with a blank sheet of paper, despite the difficulties of funding it and setting it up and all the rest of it, it was worth taking a deep breath and going for the thing that was going to give you the best tool. But funnily enough, I came out with much the same conclusion as the Growth Commission, but simply because I was an official. I have no illusions about how much work there's going to be on actually carrying out a transfer between the present situation and an independent Scotland. And I thought there was some merit in, for a limited period, I'm not so happy about 10 years, but for a limited period, having a point where we just went on using sterling and why we got ourselves sorted out effectively.
So at the very beginning of this conference, we had some data come out by YouGov and the Scottish Social Attitude Survey. YouGov saw that increase for the SNP was obviously doing very well, increasing their seats for Westminster. We also saw as well that support for independence was on the rise as well by the Attitude Survey. Would you say, in your opinion then, that with this increasing support, the SNP and the Yes movement have the momentum? Or do you think that they have still a while to go in order to pass the finish line and achieve independence?
I think it's there. I think it's starting. I think obviously it needs to keep gathering. We need to keep turning it over. I hope that this afternoon we'll get a few more things. Not a date. We don't need a date yet. But I think I was at the march. My first time I'd ever been to a march. I was at the gathering where the Yes movement focused on exactly what it was they wanted for an independent Scotland and how they thought we should try and achieve it. I think you had the Dumfries March, then you had the Growth Commission. I believe that we should, I think we are gathering momentum all the time. Groups are coming together. I've got a whole lot of issues going with leaflets. The leaflets, although I produce them, I'm SNP, they never have SNP symbols on them so that we can use them right across the Yes movement for anybody who finds them useful. And I think it's there, I think it's coming, I think it has to come. I, for one, don't want to see us fighting a referendum campaign where we will exclude. I want the EU people in this time to be voters and the youngsters in. We fought a quasi-referendum at the general election without those two groups, which severely affected the result.
Dr. Jessiman, thank you very much for joining us. Alyn Smith, MEP, thank you very much for joining us here at Broadcasting Scotland today at the SNP Conference. Thank you. That's good to get the feedback. So let's talk about, because you're MEP, so you'll be in the heart of your knowledge on Brexit. How do you think Brexit negotiations are going on right now between the EU and the UK? Big open question.
Exactly. Trying to keep the hyperbole down. It's a shambles. Every day is a new psychodrama. Every day is. I get serious MEP colleagues, serious EU officials who've been doing this for decades, asking me, as a UK MEP, as they'd see it sometimes, and what's going on? This is not serious. Because the UK Conservatives are negotiating with each other, never mind the UK Parliament, never mind Edinburgh or Cardiff or Belfast or anywhere else. We've got absolutely absurd positions being put forward on Monday, which are then pulled back by Wednesday, then put back again by Friday. So we're not seeing a serious engagement from any of the UK authorities. There's a lot of decent civil servants who are trying to make it work, but they're not being allowed to because the political level is such a shambles. So the negotiations are effectively stalled while the UK tries to sort out what it wants, while the Conservative Party has an argument with itself. Meanwhile, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, big chunks of England as well are looking at this going, this is against our interests. And lots of businesses, and I've noticed it in the past couple of weeks, a number of businesses are going from complacency to panic. And I think that's going to be the next few weeks' motif. where we see a lot of the complacency that has been in the system shocked out of people. And the danger is that we see people do silly things because they're panicking, where solutions can be found, but we need to calm all this down. We need to get some real seriousness from the UK government. And I'm glad and delighted, really proud of the way the SNP's been handling this. We've got serious people, Mike Russell, Stephen Gethins, dare I say myself as well, plugging away to try and find solutions to try and save this UK government from itself. But it's tough times. Every day there's a new drama.
We're talking about the UK government here and their idea of Brexit. We also have Labour recently put forward an amendment to the EU withdrawal bill with their claim that they now have a clear position on Brexit. Do you agree with that? Do you think Labour have now unified their position on Brexit, have a clear message of what they want?
No. Whenever a politician tells you that it's really simple or it's very clear, it really isn't. The Labour position is still unicorns for every voter. They'll negotiate a better deal somehow than any deal that has ever been done. My sense of it is that the Labour leadership actually just doesn't care about the EU stuff one way or the other. They're viewing everything through the prism of, will this help us win the Westminster election if and as and when it happens, or will it not? And it's just the parlour games of the rich and famous being played out in the Palace by the Thames. The Labour position is all over the place, depending upon who you talk to, and I've got very good links into a number of the Labour MEPs, MPs, Lords even. There are a lot of people who are trying to fix this from within the Labour Party. We need to strengthen their efforts, but we've seen this week the amendments that they're putting down to the withdrawal bill when it comes back from the House of Lords are actually going to guarantee that the House of Lords amendments are not going to be successful in the House of Commons. So it's a poor show all round.
We know that Brexit's also bringing up the issue of a power grab, that Westminster are taking powers from Holyrood that would usually devolved back from the European Union.
Yeah.
Would you agree with the idea that it's a power grab, and do you think that other parties are doing enough to back the Scottish Government in terms of defending devolution itself?
There's a remarkable, in some ways, unanimity of purpose across the parties within Holyrood. Labour signed up to the Scottish Government's motion, amended by Labour slightly. The Greens, the Liberals, all signed up as well. What the UK government's doing is using Brexit, which we didn't vote for, as a pretext to undermine devolution in principle. The principle is that everything is devolved unless it is specifically reserved to Westminster. That's being tipped on its head, allegedly for a time-limited period, but once it's gone, it's gone. And the UK government is using this as a pretext for a massive denuding of the powers of the Holyrood Parliament, and our concern is that once they're gone, they may well not be coming back anytime soon, if at all. So no government worth its salt could actually agree to this. And indeed, we've seen that all the parties at Holyrood but the Tories have signed up to that defence of devolution. Now, where that's going to go remains to be seen. It may well be the Supreme Court, may well be who knows where else, but hopefully a solution can be found. We do acknowledge that there needs to be some sort of cooperation across the two parliaments as equals, as partners, as we try and make sense of whatever Brexit's going to be. But that has to be done with the principle of consent, and it has to be done with the principle of consent issue by issue, not just in block, which is what they're looking for. So I think solutions can be found, but we're not bluffing. We are going to defend the powers of the Scottish Parliament.
So you argue that UK position is pretty much a shambles in itself. Labour are not clear on their position on Brexit. So what's the SNP's proposal in terms of Brexit?
Well, Scotland voted to remain. That's our starting point. Our clearly expressed best interests are to remain within the EU. If we can't remain within the EU because of the current constitutional status, well, independence is back on the table, clearly, but it's one option amongst many. We acknowledge that 52 is a bigger number than 48 UK-wide, now through gritted teeth, and I think it's a great shame. But solutions need to be found. Now, there's going to need to be solutions found for Northern Ireland, so damn sure we're looking for the same sort of solution to be found for us, a clearly expressed democratic desire to remain within the EU. But there's different ways of leaving the EU if that's eventually where we get to. There's the EEA, there's EFTA, there's other options. And we've put them all out in Scotland's Place in Europe, which is a cracking piece of work that was put together by real experts to try and find solutions on this. But the trouble that we've had is that the UK government isn't clear what it wants itself. So much of that then tracks back as to we're shadowboxing air. So it's been a really frustrating process, and the solution for us is that we don't want Brexit to happen at all. Scotland has clearly voted that we don't want that to be the case. There's no good news in it. There's no good news in it for the fishing industry either. I will hear no lectures about what's good for the fishing sector. The CFP, yes, needs to be fundamentally reformed, but there is no good news for the catching sector, nor the processing sector, nor the aquaculture sector in Brexit as it's looking at the moment. And we need to find solutions to this. So I hope that the solutions can be found, but from our side, we don't want Brexit to happen at all.
Talk about the fishing industry then, because we know that a large percentage of fishermen themselves are backing Brexit, although they have issue with the UK government's approach to negotiations because they'll be in the CFP for much longer. So, in your position, do you agree, or what would you rather argue, that it's easier to be in the EU and negotiate a better deal within CFP, or it's easier to leave the EU and just get out of the CFP altogether?
Well, I'd actually pick you up on the point that a lot of fishermen are backing leave. I don't see that. There are a few very vocal fishermen who are very vociferously backing leave. But the fishing industry is way more complex than just going on a boat and catching fish in the North Atlantic. There's the processing sector, there's the aquaculture sector, there's the inshore fishery, the prawn, the nephrops fishery, and we export our product into the EU single market. And the catching quotas, all of that sort of stuff, is going to be contingent upon market access, A, by EU boats into our waters, and B, of our product into the single market. It was the Norwegian minister that said, there's nothing in a hurry like a salmon on the back of a lorry. If there is the slightest delay in our product getting to the EU market, it's existential for the fisheries sector. And even if it comes to it, the catching boys will land their boats into the continental ports, same as a lot of the Norwegian boys now into Peterhead, Fraserburgh, for processing because they need to land it into the single market. If we're out the single market, it is existential for big old chunks of the fishing industry. And our job's not to be a wholly owned subsidiary of one bit of one industry. Our job's to look after the national interest of the whole sector. And the EU single market is absolutely crucial to that sector, and we need to defend that. And in terms of what we need to do within the CFP, we need to prioritise fisheries. And as an independent Scotland, we would, because fisheries is of much greater economic importance to Scotland than it is to the UK. And I have watched UK minister after UK minister trade away fisheries rights against other rights, and that's politics and that's their priorities. We would prioritise in independent Scotland the fisheries sector in the same way as Ireland has, in the same way as Denmark has, and we would get better deals because we would put a greater priority upon it. So we're not where we want to be, but the idea that Brexit's somehow going to deliver a super duper future for the fisheries sector, no it isn't. And I've read all the documents, I've read all the papers, and much of what they're looking for is entirely unachievable. And even if it was achievable, they'd need to throw the rest of the industry under the bus to get it, and I don't think that's the way we're going to go.
You picked on independence there. So at the very beginning of this conference, we saw data come out by YouGov, we saw data from the Scottish Social Attitude Survey. YouGov showed that the SNP are on the increase in terms of Westminster and in general for Holyrood as well from the last polls. We saw that independence is on the increase as well. In fact, especially the economy is more popular with independence than status quo and other options. So is this momentum now shown of the SNP and the Yes movement, or would you argue that actually there's still a fair bit to go until you cross the finish line and achieve independence?
There's a lot of things in flux at the moment. There's a lot of people anxious, feeling really quite nervous about the future, about what Brexit might mean for them, what they might mean for their economy, their society, the rest of it. There's a lot of people feeling genuinely angered about the disrespect that has been shown to Scotland about the EU stuff. We're in the process of possibly losing access to the Erasmus programme, university grants for EU research funding, the right to live, work, study, travel, even things like health insurance when you go for a weekend. You've got the European health insurance card at the moment. We'll lose that, which means that people will need to take out private health insurance to go for a weekend in Prague or Nice or wherever EasyJet's going and the rest. So all these costs are going to mount up, and people are seeing that being taken away against their will, against the clearly expressed will of the Scottish people. And that anger's, I think, yet to crystallise into something concrete. So there's still a lot of people looking at independence with fresh eyes. A number of people who were no in 2014 get it now. So they're looking very seriously at the proposition, but that's where we need to work on what the proposition is. And there's so much in flux about where Brexit Britain's eventually going to get to. That, to an extent, makes our proposition for independent Scotland contingent upon those details as they emerge. But I think as it gets clearer, I think the people of Scotland are going to have a choice between two unions, and it's in the European mainstream alongside Ireland, alongside Denmark, alongside lots of other countries do in a bloc of 500-ish million people, or in an increasingly backward-looking island run by a palace out of the Thames by a Tory party that does not have our interests at heart. And I think that's where a lot of people are going to get to quite soon, as Brexit becomes clearer. So we need to be ready for when that happens. And life's not dull at the moment. There's a lot of people feeling anxious, but I would say from the SNP's perspective, we are on it. We are working flat out to find solutions to keep people safe, to save what's best about Scotland, and those efforts are going to continue.
Alyn Smith, MP, thank you very much for joining us today at Broadcasting Scotland.
Nice to see you.
Thank you for watching the Full Scottish from the SNP Spring Conference in Aberdeen. If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We look forward to you joining us again next week when we'll be back in the studio in the Gethins. See you then.